Right, so let's break it down. Today, I'm going to review the new kid on the block, Daiwa's latest release, the Daiwa Bait Junkie Grub, and I'm going to compare it to the gold standard in grubs in Australia, the US-made ZMAN 2.5-inch grub. Let's get into it. Right, so the Daiwa Bait Junkie Grubs are scheduled to hit the market in late September, and like it or not, there's a little bit of hype around them. Whether it's warranted, time will tell. I want to do this video to provide you a bit of an example or frame of reference so that you understand what you can expect from these bad boys when they're released. And we're going to put them up against the gold standard, that is the ZMAN Grub down here. And why? Because everybody's been using these for the last number of years. They know what they look like, and they are very much the thing that everybody's going to be asking. They're going to be comparing one to the other, which one is better, and what they should spend their money on. Today we're going to have a look at the Bait Junkie and talk about the material that it's made out of, generally the design. You'll see it's a little bit more cylindrical. We're going to talk about this tail as well. I'll get some close-ups for you in a bit. We'll talk about the scent that's in there and how you can modify the lure to do a couple of different things for you that I think is pretty cool. Now, as disclosed in that pre-release Daiwa in Feet 20 rod review that's linked up there and you should totally check out, I'm not sponsored by Daiwa, and Daiwa haven't paid for this review. What I do enjoy doing is creating these amateur videos for your entertainment. I will say thank you very much to Daiwa for providing those lures behind me for me to review. I'd really like to take the channel down that path. Let me know if you think that's the way we should go. So let's briefly talk about the evolution of the grub in the Australian market, and I'd really like you to consider it when you're considering buying your next lure. ZMAN originally came out in 2011, 2012. Since this lure has made it onto the market, it's probably made its way into most estuary fishermen's tackle boxes, and without the data, I could probably shoot from the hip and say it's won the most amount of tournaments in terms of that tournament fishing lure. I guess it'd be closely followed by the cranker crab, but for sure, the ZMAN is probably the lure that I see the most photographed in amateur fishermen across Facebook. Let's be clear, at no point during this video am I calling into question the credibility or catch rate of this lure. It catches fish and it's proven. Now, before we jump on the bandwagon of which lure works for which region or which brand might have copied something from another brand, conversely, which one is claiming to be the original grub. For those of you who are new to fishing, before the ZMAN, we had the Terminator Snapback grub that was made from effectively the same material as the ZMAN. It was that first elasto kind of tough, if you like, grub. That business stopped trading, but before that even, we had the atomic fat grubs. And with those, I think around about the same time, we had the Berkeley 2-inch poo eater. And before that even, we had the Mr. Twister grubs that I personally saw in my grandfather's tackle box in what feels like the 80s or 90s. Now, that business is actually still in production today, and I would argue that that is the original. More recently, we've had the Squidgy Bio Tough Grub come to the market, the Pro Lure Grub Tail, the Hurricane Sub Grub, I'm pretty sure it's called, and even last week, Berkeley announced that they were releasing a 2.5-inch grub made out of the power bait material that you've got there. So stay with me here. Here is the light. There's over 30 plus years of development that have gone into these little guys. Not these ones specifically, but the grub profile generally. I'd suggest that if you were to ask any of the brands why they had a go at making the grub, they would all say something similar to, we thought that we could evolve the grub better than its predecessor in some way, shape or form. And I think evolution in any industry is a good one. We see it in construction, vehicles, transport. When materials improve, brands get better at doing what they're doing and they develop things that are better. Now, it's yet to be seen whether the Daiwa Grub is better, but I want to give you an insight about the lens that I'm using to view some of the stuff that's on it. Now, we'll wrap up this intro by leaving you with one solid fact. I've been fishing the ZMAN Grub since 2013, 2014. I've been fishing the Daiwa Grub for about a month, and it has accounted for the biggest brim that I have caught on a soft plastic to date. the first point I'll make is on the cylinder type shape of the lure. It's a little less tapered like the Z-Man is, and I have to admit, initially I wasn't sold on this. And the reason for that is that in the packet, it just looked a little bit more blocky, if that makes sense. Less like a grub that I'm used to seeing. Now, the idea that I didn't like the shape of it very quickly disappeared as soon as I started throwing it around. I will make the call that in my experience, this lure skips much better than the Z-Man lure. And I think that's got to do with the larger surface area of the actual tube. It doesn't bite into the water as much when you skip it across the water. To exaggerate the point, it'd be like trying to throw a jig head on its own. It doesn't skip, but then picking up a pebble and skipping a pebble. One is larger than the other, it has a larger surface area. I'm sure there's some hydrodynamics in there. If so facto, if you're talking about moon phases and considering when prawns are out and you're trying to match the hatch, I'd be looking for the Daiwa Grub in those shallow water presentations, particularly around structure, maybe some pontoons, weed beds, flats even where you'd expect prawns and bait to hang out. Actually not sure whether a Daiwa have mentioned that skipping property anywhere, but they definitely should be. Now the other point on the body is the size. So it's a 2.5 inch presentation, and if you have a look at the front there, again I'll need another close up, they've got the Daiwa symbol sitting there. Now it might look really cool, but it's actually got a really functional purpose, and that is to indicate to you where to trim the lure to make it a shorter 2-inch presentation. This lure is specifically designed for you to chop it, so I wouldn't have any hesitation with chopping these lures. That smaller presentation might appeal to you, fish are being finicky, or you're going after fish that say aren't black rim or maybe smaller yellowfin fish up in Queensland, for example. The benefit here is that gone are the days of running around with a 2-inch pack and a 2.5-inch pack of the same color. I can now run around with the one pack and have both options in the pack, kind of like a 2-in-1 if you like. So let's talk about the makeup and the construction, specifically the material that's in these lures. Now, it is still a floating material, and in terms of durability, I would put it on par with the Z-Man. I don't think there's any discernible difference between how they wear. They seem to wear exactly the same. I will say that in the hand, they appear ever so slightly more jelly-like in texture or feel, if that makes sense. So my experience with the Z-Man is that you really get 2, maybe 3 attempts to get that hook set right when you're trying to rig the jig head onto the plastic. If you do go further than that, you end up creating a bit of a cavity in the center of the lure, and that hook keeper in the center of the jig head no longer grabs the lure as well as it did originally. In that scenario, we're kind of forced down to coming up with different ideas to hold the lure on there a little bit nicer. Super glue is the common one. My experience with these Daiwa Grubs is that jelly-like texture means that this isn't really an issue. You can jab it over and over and over and over and still keep a quite positive hook set on that hook keeper in the center. Now, I'm also not ignorant, right? The more times you jab it, the looser it's going to become. I'm just saying that you probably get a good 10 shots at getting the lure straight on the jig head. You might find that interesting if you're a type of guy that doesn't like to add super glue to the front of a lure when you're putting on a jig head, or you find yourself without any super glue. Now the pre-production models that I've got give away a couple of small hints about how they are constructed. Now those hints aren't around in the production models, but I want to show you here the 2 paw lines are at the top of the lure. Those 2 lines reflect what Daiwa have been calling their 2-tone laminate, and they've key tagged that as their description of how they make the lures. You won't be able to see them, like I said, in the models that you buy from the store, but broadly speaking, it means they're able to blend 2-tone grubs, and that's something that Z-Man are yet to do. An example of that is the Oil Flash UV versus the Midnight Oil that Z-Man have got. The Midnight Oil that Z-Man have got is a blanket color of motor oil with a goldy fleckle through it. If you take the Daiwa one, it is a half-half. Half of it is pure motor oil, The other half is motor oil with the gold fleck, a little bit more of a subtle presentation if that's what you're into. Now with that two-tone concept, they've gone full up in terms of colors, so check them out on that Daiwa fishing website. There's a little cool UV button that you can hit, and every single one of the lures is UV. So if you're not into UV, the Bait Junkie Grubs aren't for you. You should be into UV. Now don't worry, we're going to come back to colors. Before we finish the video, I'm going to give you my recommendations on which colors that you should be looking at and that have caught fish for some of the internal testers and myself. All right, so back onto the material. It's been my experience that fish go after these lures. They crunch them hard and seldom do they let them go. Now, it could be for a few different reasons, but I like to think it's that jelly-like texture that gets into their mouth and they like what they feel. I don't feel like I've been missing bites with these lures as much as traditionally I might have been. It is noticeable to me that there is a bit of a difference. The fish so far have just been crunching them. A late mail on this guy. I'd go to the Daiwa website after and have a bit of a read, and they basically say that they've got this amino X flavor in it. Now, they advertise this as being a natural based flavor and scent which masks unnatural odors and smells from the plastic. The addition of the amino X means that when fish bite, they hold on to longer, what that guy just said, giving anglers more time to react and ultimately more fish in the boat. Daiwa nailed it. Now, I found it interesting that they omitted it, but on the pack there is nowhere, it is not written that there is shrimp power oil that you can residually see on the bottom of every pack. Now, they come with their own scent, which is kind of cool, and the way I want you to think about this is almost gulp-like in terms of putridness. As soon as you open these bad boys, they stink. Now the last thing that I'll talk about in terms of the design and the notable difference is the tail. It is ever so slightly smaller than the Z-Man tail. When you put them next to each other, you can definitely tell. The Z-Man kind of curls back toward the body ever so slightly, and that Bait Junkie just stops at that parallel. Now, Daiwa are advertising that as though it is 100% done on purpose. So I swum them side by side as a test, and then I went to the closest thing in Australia that we have to a pro angler. This fella that looks like Moses, and if you don't know him, he's the guy that also happened to have a great deal in developing the lure itself. He explained that the idea behind that tail paralleling the body is so that when the water hits the tail first, the tail folds rearward. It doesn't collapse toward the body like another lure might. Daiwa then doubled down on that and made the thickness of the tail also smaller. So the performance of the tail of the Bait Junkie Grub is really good, but so is the Z-Man. On one hand, nobody's ever calling into question the action of the tail on a Z-Man. We all know it is sweet. The other side of the coin is that Daiwa's first cut at doing this has actually resulted in something that matches it really, really nicely and puts it on par. So I think the people that came up with that can hold their head up high. All right, so I'm gonna wrap this up and I'm gonna start to talk about the colors that I think you should buy. Now, I've got some notes here, so bear with me. I will say that the lure range that we're looking at here isn't one range that's gonna have one or two colors that hold the rest of it up. Yes, motor oil is gonna be one of their best sellers, but I'd suggest if you have a look at the color range and the palette that is in there, a lot of the colors are proven. So from personal experience, the Bloodworm, Oil Flash, Pearl Watermelon, and Mudblood have all got fish for me, and that yabby color I mentioned before is the one that attributed to my largest fish on the soft plastic. It looks like on the website they've brought back the Wakasagi color that was a proven color back in the day in oyster racks, but I haven't used that yet. I'm actually excited to get my hands on that bad boy. Now, grossly, I also wanted to mention the lure that looks like vomit and feels like grot, but for some reason catches fish, and that is that camo color. Mumsy word on the inside circles for the testers, and from my personal experience, the thing catches fish. The trouble with it though is getting it onto the hook, because whenever I look at it, I just think it's gross personally, and so I'm just gonna have to get over that. Right, so there's some bass colors in there. I'll let the bass guys talk about that. I'd be faking it otherwise. But outside of the motor oil, I'd be recommending these three colors: the yabby, the mudblood, and the camo. Those three are my standouts. Now, like Z-Man, these bad boys come in a clamshell. Now, it is a full clamshell, not a half clamshell, so it's got both the lids on it, and I would suggest that they've done a really smart thing here by making them a mirror image, so you don't have to muck around with making sure that you've got the right you got it the right way around. They fit in mirror. That there is the pearl watermelon. You can see it kind of flicker with that blue oily streak through it. It's actually a really nice color. Now, the plastics are no different to the Z-Man in terms of rigging, but I do find that they swim a little bit better with the hook away from the tail of the plastic. In terms of how you fish them, exactly the same. And if you're new to the grub fishing scene and you're curious about it, I've got a video up there that talks about some of the techniques to smash and fish on these lures. Second last point, I'm not the type of guy that's going to tell you to abandon the lure that you are confident in. As we all know, confidence fishing is a really important facet to catching fish, and you have to be confident with the lure first and foremost. Finally, I'll leave you with 3 facts. 1, the list of people that have developed this lure is both long and credible. I would argue that many of the names on that list are the creme de la creme of the fishing tackle industry. 2, the first competition where they were put into test, the guys came 3rd. It's currently being used by a few anglers this weekend at the Queensland ABT Open, and I've already seen fish being caught on it on a live stream. And 3, which is kind of a repeat on a fact I gave you earlier. I've been using Z-Man since 2013, and within a month of using the Bait Junkie, I've accounted for the largest fish that I've caught on a soft plastic. Coincidence or not, you decide, you have a go. Hope you've enjoyed the review. Stay safe.